Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're digging into a single, really powerful idea from an ancient text, the sin of partiality, or what we'd probably just call favoritism. And we're going to trace how this principle, which seems so simple, actually has huge implications for how we see each other, our history, and even some of the biggest debates happening right now.
Okay, let's just dive right into this. Have you ever felt that quick scan someone gives you, that snap judgment they make based on what you're wearing or how you talk? It's this, universal human thing, and it's right at the heart of what we're talking about today.
So here's our roadmap. We're going to start by defining this sin of appearances right from the source, the book of James. Then we'll look at the ultimate standard for being impartial and see why breaking this one rule is considered such a huge deal. From there, we'll trace its impact through history, apply that same lens to a very modern debate, and then finally, we'll get to the powerful solution that the text itself offers.
All right, so our journey starts in the second chapter of the book of James. It's this ancient letter written to early Christians, and the author, well, he doesn't waste any time. He gets straight to the point with a command that is direct, it's challenging, and it really sets the stage for everything else.
The instruction here is absolute, no wiggle room. James is basically arguing that if you say you have faith in this glorious, transcendent Lord, you just cannot also be showing favoritism to people. The two things just don't go together. It's a fundamental contradiction. So what are we actually talking about when we say partiality? Well, think about it. The clothes someone wears, the job title they have, their social status, how many followers they have online. The sources define partiality as judging someone based on all that external stuff. It's all about looking at the cover, not the book, and then treating them better or worse because of it. And to make this crystal clear, James paints this really vivid picture. Imagine a guy walks into your gathering. He's got gold rings on, he's wearing expensive clothes. You can just tell he's important. And what happens? Immediately, everyone rushes to give him the best seat in the house. But then, right after him, another guy comes in. His clothes are shabby, dirty. He clearly has nothing. And the reception he gets? It's the complete opposite. He's told, hey, you, just stand over there in the corner, or even worse, sit on the floor by my feet. James says that is making distinctions with evil motives. It's a total rejection of the faith you say you have. So why is this such a big deal? Why is this sin treated so seriously? Well, the sources argue it's because partiality is the polar opposite of the character of God and the lived example of Jesus Christ, who is held up as the ultimate standard. You see this all through the biblical sources, that God is impartial. He's no respecter of persons, which is an old way of saying he doesn't judge based on face value or external status. His justice doesn't bend for the rich or the famous. So if that's what God is like, his followers are supposed to reflect that same character. And the life of Christ is presented as the ultimate example of this in action, just a constant flipping of the world's values on their head. He who was rich chose to become poor. He deliberately hung out with the outcasts of society. And then, in this incredible act of humility, he washed his followers' feet, a job reserved for the lowest of the low, basically destroying all social hierarchies. Okay, this next part is where things get really interesting, because James just dramatically raises the stakes. He takes what might seem like a small social mistake, playing favorites, and turns it into this massive, catastrophic failure. First, he links partiality directly to what he calls the royal law, which is one of the two greatest commandments. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. It's pretty simple, right? By giving the rich guy the good seat and telling the poor guy to sit on the floor, you are fundamentally failing to love your neighbor. It's a direct violation. But then he takes it a step further. He makes this pretty radical claim about the nature of God's moral law. He argues it's not some pick-and-choose buffet. In fact, if you fail in just one little part of it, the shocking conclusion is that you're guilty of breaking the whole thing. The law is presented not as a checklist where you can feel good about getting most of them right, but more like a single pane of glass. If you put a crack in it in just one spot, even with a small sin like partiality, the whole thing is compromised. Now, this isn't just some abstract theological idea. The sources argue its violation has had devastating real-world consequences. They point specifically to the history of racism within the American church as a tragic, large-scale example of this very sin. The sources trace this really painful history. In the 18th century, many evangelicals were actually fighting against slavery. But by the 19th century, especially in the American South, a lot of churches just got quiet. And you have to ask why. The argument is they showed partiality to their wealthy slave-owning members.
This legacy of favoritism, of siding with the powerful over the oppressed, continued right through the civil rights era, and, the sources argue, is a major reason why Sunday morning is still one of the most segregated hours in America. Okay, let's bring this into the here and now. The sources we're looking at apply this same ancient principle of impartiality to critique the modern framework of diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI. And they argue that, ironically, some forms of it can become a new type of partiality. So a really key distinction is made here. On one hand, the sources define biblical justice as equality of opportunity, where every single person is treated impartially, no matter their group identity. This is then contrasted with the modern DEI concept of equity, which is often defined not as equal opportunity, but as equality of outcome, meaning different identity groups have to achieve the same results. And this chart breaks that down even more. The sources argue that while words like diversity, equity, and inclusion sound really good and even biblical, their definitions within many DEI frameworks are actually very different. So, for example, they point out that the word equity shifts from meaning impartiality and fairness to meaning equal outcomes. And to get those equal outcomes, you actually need preferential treatment, not impartiality. To really make this point, the sources cite influential DEI advocates like Ibram X. Kendi, and they highlight this statement from him. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. This is presented as a clear call for what's called anti-racist discrimination, using discrimination today to try and engineer equal outcomes between groups. And that brings us to the core of the critique. The sources argue that from a biblical perspective, this call for preferential treatment based on group identity, judging someone not as an individual but by their race or background to achieve a specific result, well, that's the very definition of the sin of partiality. So, if the law is so strict that one little act of favoritism makes us guilty of everything, and if we're all honest, we all fail at this, what hope is there? Well, the text itself gives us the answer. And it's not about just trying harder. It's about a completely different principle. This is the powerful conclusion. This is the antidote. The answer to a system of judgment that we have all failed is mercy. The person who has truly understood and received God's mercy, the sources argue, is finally free. They're free from the need to suck up to the powerful or to look down on the weak. They're secure, and because they're secure, they can extend that same mercy to everyone else. And that brings this whole thing right back to us, doesn't it? It forces us to ask a really personal question. In our own lives, at work, in our friend groups, in our own hearts, who do we automatically give the good seat to? And who do we, maybe without even thinking about it, tell to stand over in the corner? The answer to that question reveals exactly where we still need mercy to triumph over judgment.